I really want to thank everybody who organized this. For me, this is very exciting, actually, to be around a bunch of people who think about public opinion in an applied way on the topics that I really, truly care about. As I think that very generous introduction pointed out, political campaigning is, it's fine. But what I really care about is human rights and social campaigning issues. The original title of this was supposed to be Data-Driven Human Rights Campaigning, the Israel Experience, and I would just like to say I wish that it was Data-Driven Human Rights Campaigning. So I massaged it a little bit to explain what I really think it is, which is public opinion research serving human rights to some extent. And I will try to explain briefly sort of what I do and how I got to the project that we talked about in 3 parts. One, what I do in general, why what I do is relevant for civil society, and why they come to me, why various kinds of NGOs come to me. Why the Israeli human rights organizations as a group, 10 of them, approached me for this particular project, and then what we tried to do and what we continue to do and hope to achieve. All of that in 15 minutes. Okay, so what do? For 16 years, basically since 1999, I've been working as a public opinion researcher, a pollster, although I don't like to say pollster because it really involves qualitative and quantitative research, designing, supervising, and analyzing public opinion projects for political campaigns and many kinds of social campaigns. And electoral campaigns are one thing, but as anybody who's worked in political campaigning knows, modern campaigns involve the concept of the permanent campaign. So it's not just about getting elected, it's about continuing to communicate your policies and be in constant interaction with the public. That's the sort of mentality that I bring to the projects that I do with civil society as well. And so I work on a range of public affairs projects and issues in Israel and in many other countries. I've worked on issues of European accession in Romania and Hungary back in the day, anti-corruption policy in places like Bulgaria. I even worked with the Athens Olympic Organizing Committee, one of the best things ever. And a lot of my research is around the conflict dynamics. So I would say out of my research in Israel that is not for political campaigns, I would say about 60 to 70% of it involves the conflict, and I've also done that kind of research in the Balkans, particularly with relation to Serbia and Kosovo. And so the kinds of issues this includes for different NGOs who come to me are basically, again, related to the conflict and peace process, civil rights, democracy issues, religious secular tensions in Israel, identity issues, immigrants and minorities, Arab-Jewish relations, overlapping. And on rare occasion, I even do some corporate issue work, but that's very rare. Obviously, it's not really where my heart lies. The point is that for most of my career, pretty much everybody from civil society who cared about this range of issues was coming to me for some sort of public opinion input, except the human rights organizations. Okay, and that was the situation up until about 2010. So why did they suddenly come? Well, let me explain first of all why those NGOs actually come to me. It may be intuitive, but I want to go through, I would say about 5 reasons why it was important for them to learn about public opinion systematically. One is that they're addressing public issues, right? These are public affairs, and they're mostly making strategy and policy and communications based on guesswork about what the public actually thinks. So first of all, it's affirming, checking what the public actually thinks about the topics that I mentioned before, instead of wasting a lot of resources, time, money on by going on instinct. The second is obviously the need to strategize, and when I say strategize, I know we use this term strategizing quite loosely. Nobody really knows what it means. What I mean by that is identifying target groups, subpopulations, segmenting them into those who are on your side, those who are hopelessly against you, and those who could be on your side if you spoke to them in the right way. Tailoring the messages. Any campaign person knows about this stuff. Again, I don't want you to get bored because you're a campaign person. And looking at who the opposition is, who's against you, who's working to take you down, and how to respond to their attacks, which attacks are strong, and how to respond to them. The third reason is public attention. Right? Journalists and editors love polls because they can make little stories about them even on a slow news day. So sometimes they're stuff to just get it out there what the public thinks. People like to think about themselves, so people like to read, hey, 60% of us think X, Y, Z. They're also useful for evaluation and assessment. E&A, I've been asked to do a lot of that kind of thing to try to evaluate, and it's good for NGOs who need to do benchmarks. So start with understanding where the public is, implement your program, then do a follow-up research. That's the fourth reason, and a fifth reason overlaps with that, which is donors and stakeholders. Sometimes I've had clients coming to me saying, our donors will be really impressed to see us actually tracking public opinion and how our activities are having an impact on public opinion in a systematic, methodological way. One of them actually went and put together what he called an investor pack to use public opinion data in addition to a bunch of other materials to go around to donors to try to raise money for a new project. And then there's the sixth reason, which is really the reason why the human rights organizations came to me in 2010. and that is crisis management. Okay. Normally, crisis management comes from politicians, because they're always in some sort of crisis, or sometimes corporate issues, but the human rights organizations in 2010 came under attack, and this is the second part. Why did they come to me? Why did they feel the need for this project? I won't go into it in too much depth for time limitations, and also one of my open global rights articles is about it, but basically, in the situation of ongoing violent, lethal conflict, this is not a frozen conflict in the sense of, well, in any sense, but specifically it's not a frozen conflict in the sense of the number of victims, right? There's always people dying every day. It's not something from the past. Human rights organizations dealing with Palestinian rights are essentially, in the minds of Israelis, protecting the enemy. So we're familiar with this concept, and there was sort of a peak of sort of hostility against them around 2010, following a number of things that were going on, which again, we don't have time to go into. But there was a really unprecedented level of vitriol in Israeli society around them, and they started to feel like it was really influencing their capacity to do the kinds of work they wanted to do, really creating constraints. Of course, crisis management is a key component in any political campaign. What I would have liked to do is launch into a full body, full throttle kind of, total campaign mode, which means creating a really unified message or a series of messages, repeating them over and over and over until everybody's sick of them. Hit back, fast against all the opponents, demolish their arguments, and do massive research, of course, to segment out the populations. In other words, dream on. There was no way that anybody was going to. And in truth, I think one of the things we started talking about is that the NGOs in general, but specifically the human rights community, wasn't used to thinking in campaign mentality. So that wasn't the kind of thing we could do. But I say dream on not only because of those constraints on the project, but when you're working on a political campaign, you hope that there is one top decision maker, and that's the candidate who, the buck stops here. Never mind that in the last Israeli campaign we had nothing of the sort. But this is all off record, right? Okay. It's fine. I've said this everywhere I can. I'm just kidding. Anyway, the point is, not only do we have those kinds of resource constraints, but we had not one client, not one candidate, but not one decision maker, but 10 organizations, human rights organizations, 10 different executive directors. You can guess how many opinions that involved. And that was one constraint. These are pluralistic organizations by nature. They might agree or disagree. But another one of the constraints was that some of them didn't even really feel this was a valuable goal. I mean, some of them said, these are longtime veterans in the Israeli human rights scene. They said, we've never been liked. We're never going to be liked. They will always hate us. Certainly as long as the conflict is going on, and probably after that as well. So what's the point? And then, on the other hand, there were increasing constraints, as I mentioned, on their work, which involved things like a hostile environment, difficulty getting audiences with the kinds of agencies and government officials they may need to work with, and this onslaught in the Israeli sort of political discourse and in op-ed pages and such, but also legislation. At the time, there was, for the first time, a bill was introduced that would try to, crack down or sort of pressure them in terms of their foreign funding. We know all about this. This is very timely because that bill refused to die and has been revived recently in even a more crazy form and kind of symbolically crazy form of having them identify themselves with little tags. You can imagine the associations in the Israeli mind about that. So anyway, how did we deal with this? We began a year-long strategic consultation process. It was not necessarily intended as a public opinion research project. They happened to take me out of a few candidates, but there was a long consultation process over the course of a year, which again, I'd rather you read about in the article if you're interested. But in the end, we decided we had developed a number of insights, a lot of messaging ideas, and a lot of general approaches. And again, they sounded good to us, but we didn't know really whether they would be good or not. So we decided that with the extra budget we had, with the remaining budget at the end, we would devote it to some sort of public opinion research. And now I'll get to the third part, which is, I'll try to slow down a little bit. I don't know how much time I have left, but I want to give some detail here because most of you are practitioners in the field of public opinion research, and so you can understand how I tried to design the research. And while I do that, I'll try to show you some of the insights that we got along the way. Of course, this is again a very short case. Fine, perfect, 5 minutes. We began with qualitative, and again, I'm going to make a little bit of a pitch here because I know that the work you guys have been doing is amazing, and again, it's really exciting for me to know that it's happening. I feel like it can only be enriched with bringing that dimension of letting people express this stuff in their own words, because ultimately, and there are many arguments for that, but I would say the biggest reason is because when we design a survey, we frame it in our own way. And we don't know to what extent people are not really connecting to the question and answering in ways that don't totally reflect, but not because they're hiding anything, just because you can really get at it from their own perspectives when you let people talk openly. You get a sense of what is emotional for them and what's not emotional, what is salient for them in a different way. So we began with qualitative research, and that was research, again, for significant budget limitations for that project. We focused that entirely on target groups. So we looked at people who define themselves as centrists, right, on the theory that looking at the right wing is going to be impossible to deal with human rights for Palestinians. We looked at self-defined centrists. We looked at people on the center left, okay, ignoring kind of the far left, who we pretty much assume was on our side anyway. We're looking at what we call target groups, the ones who could possibly be won over. And actually, in one of the follow-up projects, we even did a focus group with people who had a legal background, thinking maybe if they'd been trained in law, they had a background in human rights, and that might be an argument that opens their mind. Turns out, no, they had no interest. They were mostly in law, in unrelated fields, but it was interesting to look at them. And through those focus groups, we were able to gather from people why they hate us, right? We were able to hear all the different, deconstruct it. And so it doesn't look so much like a lost cause when you actually hear, wait, there are really genuine, concrete reasons that maybe some of them can be addressed in different ways. We also heard the reasons why they actually like us, even though they kind of felt hostile, but there were some reasons why they thought that human rights organizations were a good thing, and we thought about how to capitalize on those. And then again, we looked at sort of the strongest attacks and responses and developed initial ideas for what we could test in the quantitative survey. So when we moved into the quantitative, we also focused that on the sort of target population, which in Israel is the Jewish population. In other words, we thought we don't have the budget to do everything. We're going to leave the Arab population aside. People know the distinction between Arab citizens of Israel, on the theory that they're pretty well supportive of Palestinian human rights anyway, and that it's not our biggest problem. So what we did is a pretty short but comprehensive survey. We tried to map the general environment, start to focus in on the human rights issues, and then think about initial messaging. So for example, you don't need to look at all the data, but we tried to give a range of institutions and political figures in addition to starting to test human rights themes so that we can set the general context. In other words, if we had just said, how do you feel about human rights organizations? Let's say Israel HR groups, 41% say positive. We wouldn't really know what that meant until we put it in the bigger context of how people feel about society in general. So you can take a look at some of these. First, we asked just about social organizations, just to see what people felt about civil society. Okay. Then in the analysis, what we did is try to, boil this down. This is back in 2011, remember. The analysis is just sort of isolating what you really want to know. And that's when you come up with this, which is that general human rights organization, the concept of human rights has 2/3 support, right? So people aren't against it in principle. The Israeli human rights NGOs, well, that support kind of drops to 41%. And then when you specify Israeli human rights organizations protecting Palestinian human rights, you get a very low rate of favorability, and over half who are unfavorable. And I can tell you that among the target groups, the situation was no better. In other words, even among the left, we had about half of the population who felt negative about them. Yes, I'm telling you, the concept of what defines left is complicated, and this was a really, really bad time. Okay, so that's how we sort of map the general environment. Not that any of us think it's any better at this point. Okay, and then what we start to think, so one thing that people I think often imagine about surveys is that, well, it's all very well and good for telling us what people feel. Maybe we knew that already, maybe we didn't know that already, but it's just a snapshot. You've probably heard this critique, it's just a snapshot of where the public is. Well, the idea of campaigning and strategic surveys is to see where you can take the public, where they can think in the future. Not based on a sort of, top-down, condescending, I think this, therefore you should think that, but based on what you've been telling us in the focus groups and through the analysis, what kinds of ideas you can draw on to build messages people might listen to. And so here's just a sample. We actually had about 8 different messages, and apropos experiments, we often do split testing, right? So half sample this way, half sample that way. But I just took, a few of them, mostly to show you the most successful, the least successful, and so you could also see the range. In other words, we didn't just get 54% support for everything. There was there was variation in how people look at these different messages. These are also condensed, but one of the things that works very well in political campaigning, by the way, especially if you're working with a political candidate who's been in office for a long time and has managed to generate the kind of resentment that every politician generates, is to do what we call the acknowledgement. Say, hey, I made mistakes in the past. I'm not perfect. And I intend to take responsibility for that and do better. And so we developed something like that which was not exactly, I'd like to think of it as not kowtowing to the Israeli public, but saying, things really are complicated, and we may not always do everything right, but our goal is to be cautious and accurate and provide professional information. It was a little bit more of a detailed message. And you can see, maybe not surprisingly, that one did the best out of all the messages, quite, by a pretty significant margin. Another one was just to acknowledge that Israelis feel that these organizations are actually subversive to the Israeli identity. Okay, and there can be no underestimating, certainly for anybody in IR who deals with nationalism and stuff, there can be no underestimating the importance of identity. And it's not intuitive for any reason. I can explain it afterwards, but people felt like these organizations are absolutely working to sabotage Israeli identity. So reinforcing that had some sort of traction. And by the way, the question we asked was, to what extent does this raise the trust of the human rights organizations? Keep that in mind. It wasn't about, does this make you more supportive of human rights? It was about specifically focusing on human rights organizations. Another message was to try to explain that human rights can be something that is above politics, and that it's a universal concept. You don't have to be left or right to identify and to want to protect the rights of people, even the ones who are doing bad things to us. The one that surprisingly didn't do so well, but I always felt like we just didn't quite get it right yet, but what the Israelis call the to'al-tani argument, the cost-benefit argument, which is violating people's human rights makes them angrier and angrier. If we protect their human rights, maybe they won't be such a security threat. And it did. Even I would say in this environment, even almost half the population saying it raises credibility is not a bad thing. But it did come out lowest in the other ones. Still, the fact that we had a bunch of these messages, despite the variation, gave the organizations a lot of material to work with. And then they basically could do whatever they wanted with it. And so I'll just close up by saying some of the things that they tried to do with it. It's important to remember that this is not a one-for-one. I recommend do this and then they all do it. No, it's not a political campaign. Again, for all the reasons we said before, people do different things with it. But they did ask me to continually